Hello, welcome to NewPod. How does a real estate idea transform into a project that can actually be evaluated, negotiated, or purchased? Between initial research, verifications, financing, commitments, and deadlines, each step brings new information. Following their sequence helps make decisions with greater perspective. Someone discovers the presentation of a future real estate development. The images show a completed complex. The spaces are easy to imagine, and the narrative gives the impression that the project already exists in its final form. However, what they see corresponds to one moment in a much longer journey. Before considering a purchase or another form of commitment, they need to understand the project's current status, which steps have been completed, and which still require verification. This hypothetical situation reveals a common tension. The desire to envision clashes with uncertainties related to time, the market, and documentation. A real estate development gradually transforms an opportunity into a structured project, then into a completed realization, through several coordinated decisions. Each phase influences the next without fully guaranteeing it. Therefore, starting by understanding the project's context prevents equating a marketing image with a concrete, dated, and written element. The first useful question is less about the final appearance and more about the current status of the project file. The stages of a development project are not just an administrative list. They organize how an idea confronts the site, the market, financing, applicable regulations, and the capacity of partners. Information obtained early can modify the design. A constraint discovered later can affect the timeline or conditions. For the buyer or partner, knowing this order helps understand why some data is firm and why others remain provisional. It also facilitates formulating precise questions. Which milestone produced this document? Who is responsible for it? And which decision still depends on a future event? Two shortcuts must be avoided. The first is believing that an announced project is already settled in all its details. The second assumes that uncertainty necessarily makes the operation bad. A reasonable interpretation identifies the nature of the uncertainty, its importance, and how it is managed. A competent professional should accompany any significant decision. The first phase involves defining the project's context. An opportunity becomes relevant only in relation to a location, a market, and an objective. It's necessary to identify the intended uses, the needs the operation aims to meet, and any visible constraints. This definition provides a basis for subsequent research. Without it, the project risks accumulating attractive qualities that are poorly connected to real demand. For someone examining the offer, this step translates into concrete questions. What need is presented? What information supports this interpretation? And how does the location contribute to the proposal? Marketing can make the intention understandable, but it doesn't replace the data that supports it. A clear objective doesn't guarantee the outcome. It provides a criterion for evaluating the consistency of subsequent decisions. The market can evolve and priorities can be adjusted. Defining, therefore, does not mean freezing too early, but giving the project a sufficiently precise direction to verify its feasibility. Before proceeding, a summary sheet can gather essential elements: identities of stakeholders, project nature, location, announced characteristics, indicative timeline, envisioned financing, and available documents. This sheet separates three categories. Facts are supported by identifiable evidence. Assumptions are used to build a scenario but can change. Unknowns still require answers. This distinction prevents a hoped-for piece of data from subtly transforming into a certainty during discussions. It also reveals dependencies. A stage might await verification, a decision, or an agreement before progressing. The goal isn't to reduce the entire operation to a spreadsheet, but to have a common map for communication. A serious partner should be able to clarify their role and direct to the source of important information. If a piece of data strongly influences the decision, it deserves written documentation. The summary then becomes a tool for comparison and preparation for professional guidance without replacing legal or financial analysis. The verification phase confronts the intention with accessible information. The location, project characteristics, applicable regulations, and announced conditions must be examined with competent professionals. Good commercial consistency alone doesn't prove that every point is confirmed. One must ask which documents support the claims and what date they correspond to. An old, general, or incomplete document may require an update or explanation. Compliance isn't an impression of seriousness. It refers to the project's agreement with relevant requirements. When doubt arises, the correct response is to document it and seek advice, not to conclude alone from a summary. This step may lead to adapting the project, requesting an additional condition, or abandoning an option. This is not an unproductive detour. Verification reduces avoidable surprises and transforms discovered limitations into explicit parameters for decision-making. Economic structuring relates necessary resources, financing, timeline, and anticipated results. It is not limited to a final price or a promise of profitability. Each assumption must be identifiable to understand how the scenario reacts to market changes, financing costs, or delays. A calculation presented without source, date, or clear scope remains difficult to evaluate. To compare several options, a consistent basis must be used, and what is not included should be noted. A favorable scenario can illustrate a possibility. It is neither a guarantee of return nor an assured future value. The solidity of the reasoning also appears in its ability to examine deviations from forecasts. For a personal decision, tax, asset, or financial consequences require tailored advice. At a general level, the rule remains simple. The economic presentation must show its assumptions, dependencies, and uncertainties rather than hide them behind a single result. As the project progresses, preparatory discussions give way to formalized commitments. This transition is crucial. An intention, an estimate, or a presentation does not carry the same obligation as a signed document. Before each commitment, it is necessary to identify the parties, the object, the conditions, the deadlines, and the responsibilities. The documents must be read together, as a definition or a reservation may be found elsewhere than on the most visible page. An ambiguous contract, an untraceable reference, or an oral response incompatible with the text requires a pause. Clarification must be obtained in writing and reviewed by a competent professional when the stakes demand it. Pressure related to the calendar does not transform an ununderstood clause into an acceptable clause. This phase also concerns the quality of communication. Each stakeholder must know what decision is expected, based on what information, and with what consequences. Formalization does not artificially slow down the project. It makes roles and commitments traceable. Execution gradually transforms documents and decisions into a finished work. For those tracking the project, the challenge is to understand the announced timeline, key milestones, and how changes will be communicated. A provisional deadline does not have the same weight as a defined commitment. This difference must be explained without jargon. Possible deviations sometimes influence financing, personal organization, or a partner's strategy. Therefore, they cannot be treated as a late detail. Clear monitoring indicates the progress status, new information, still needed decisions, and known consequences. It keeps important exchanges in writing to prevent multiple versions from circulating. A project's quality is also measured by this communication capability during execution, not just by its initial presentation. When a modification affects an essential element, it must be put back into the overall file and accompanied according to its nature. Execution remains an active verification stage, not a period where all vigilance becomes useless. As the operation becomes clearer, its position must be reevaluated against the market and location. Information used initially may evolve, while other projects or offers become available. A useful comparison is not just about price. It examines characteristics, conditions, timeline, document quality, and identified risks. The location must be considered in its concrete uses and within the project's context, without becoming an automatic promise of value increase. The market provides benchmarks, not certainty about the future. This reevaluation helps confirm that the initial objective remains consistent and that accepted compromises are still reasonable. It can confirm the choice, lead to negotiating a point, or make another option preferable. None of these conclusions can be deduced from a general trend alone. Judgment must remain adapted to the situation and, for a significant commitment, be informed by appropriate legal, financial, or real estate expertise. A promise of quick profit, guaranteed profitability, or assured future value does not honestly describe the uncertainties of a real estate development. Results depend on the market, location, financing, deadlines, and project quality. At each stage, a strong assertion must be matched with concrete, quantified, and written elements. If it is based on a scenario, the assumptions and limitations must appear. If it concerns a commitment, the document that carries it must be identifiable. The repetition of an argument does not replace this proof. Marketing can highlight real assets and facilitate understanding, but it becomes deceptive when it erases conditions or presents a projection as an acquired result. Credible communication accepts questions, recognizes what remains to be verified, and distinguishes facts from expectations. This framework allows for not opposing development and marketing. Each retains a useful role as long as the words used correspond to the project's actual maturity. For signals justify suspending a decision. The first is an ambiguous contract whose consequences cannot be clearly explained. The second is an overly strong promise, especially when it concerns a return, future value, or timeline presented without uncertainty. The third is a lack of information concerning an element capable of modifying the choice. The fourth is doubt about the project's compliance. In each of these cases, proceeding under emotion or pressure increases the risk of accepting a misunderstood situation. It is necessary to state the precise point, request the necessary documents and answers, then consult the competent professional. An oral explanation can prepare the exchange, but critical information must be obtained in a traceable form. Support is not reserved for the last moment of signing. It intervenes as soon as a question goes beyond factual verification or involves legal, tax, asset, or financial consequences specific to the individual. A developer's or partner's credibility is verified throughout the process. Their identity, role, assumed responsibilities, and the consistency of their documents must be understandable. Relevant information can be compared with available public or official sources, with the help of a specialist when interpretation is complex. A known brand, a polished presentation, or a pleasant business relationship does not guarantee the quality of the particular project. Conversely, verification is not about seeking reasons for distrust everywhere. It confirms that the interlocutors are who they claim to be, that commitments are made by the right parties, and that responses remain consistent from one stage to another. The credible partner accepts comparison and provides concrete elements without transforming urgency into a permanent argument. This continuity matters. A clear file at the beginning must remain traceable during negotiation, formalization, and monitoring. Trust then becomes the result of verifiable information, not its substitute. To analyze a project today, a 5-part framework can be constructed. The first lists essential elements and indicates the project's current stage. The second compares several offers or scenarios on a common basis. The third gathers concrete, quantified, and written information with its date and source. The fourth verifies the identity, role, and credibility of the partners. The fifth notes emotions and pressures that might rush the decision. This framework does not automatically produce a choice and does not replace any personalized advice. It makes questions visible and prepares for a more effective exchange with professionals. An empty box is not necessarily a definitive flaw. It indicates information to be obtained before the relevant milestone. New information can modify the comparison, which justifies updating the document. The method thus follows the project instead of freezing judgment at the first presentation. A final review can focus on the transitions between stages, as this is often where information changes status. An initial hypothesis can become a confirmed characteristic, an indicative date can be framed by a commitment, and a commercial intention can receive a precise contractual translation. It is necessary to identify the document that materializes each evolution and verify that previous versions do not continue to circulate as if they were current. This method also helps identify decisions still pending and the people responsible for making them. If a transition remains unclear, the timeline should not be used to force a conclusion. A written response and appropriate support allow for measuring the consequence before proceeding. The journey then becomes readable not only as a succession of phases, but as a chain of evidence, validations, and responsibilities. This continuity protects communication between the developer, its partners, and those considering engagement. A sound real estate decision relies on clear information, realistic objectives, and serious support. A development project progresses from an initial definition through verifications, structuring, commitments, and then monitored execution. At each stage, available facts increase, but uncertainties may remain or change in nature. The market, location, financing, deadlines, and project quality influence results without allowing a promise of profitability or future value. Understanding this progression helps ask the right question at the right time and distinguish a confirmed document from a commercial projection. An ambiguous contract, missing information, an absolute promise, or doubt about compliance requires a pause and professional advice. This episode remains general information, not personalized legal, tax, asset, or real estate advice. The next, What is a Purchase Agreement?, will delve into an important document encountered in the decision-making process. Position the project in its journey, compare available information, and seek support for every important commitment. Find NewPod to then delve into the role of a purchase agreement.